Hello, my name is John Malloy, Director of the Centre for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College, based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Welcome to The Moment, where we explore the choices we make together in support of the common good. You're listening to our special series entitled Beyond Culture Wars, Fostering Solidarity in an Age of Polarization, which looks at our upcoming 2024 conference to be held at Luther and Waterloo from April 18th to the 20th, exploring a more positive role for religion in countering our current culture wars mentality. Today, we are in conversation with Natalie Appleyard, Socio-economic Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice in Ottawa and a workshop leader at the conference. Welcome to The Moment, Natalie.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Natalie, you work at Citizens for Public Justice, and for those listeners who are not familiar, could you tell us a little bit about the organization, its mandate, and your role?
Sure. So Citizens for Public Justice, or CPJ, is an organization of members inspired by faith to act for justice in Canadian public policy. So we are a Christian organization. We're based in the CRC tradition 60 years ago, but CPJ has always been ecumenical, and we've always worked with people of other faiths and with non-faith-based groups as well. And our work involves research and advocacy related to three main issues in Canadian public policy. So our focus is on poverty in Canada, which is my portfolio, climate justice, and refugee and migrant rights. So our main work is to do research and advocacy, but also to create learning opportunities and nonpartisan advocacy opportunities for other people who are concerned about these issues, who want to learn more, and again, to build solidarity across these movements, across these issues, across the country.
Now, you mentioned your involvement with poverty. What's specifically your role?
So I'm a Socio-economic Policy Analyst, and that maybe doesn't sound very exciting, but I get to work with many wonderful people. So I do policy research and connect with other people that have research or lived experience related to poverty in Canada. So that could include housing, income supports, health, decent work, childcare, food security, lots of different issues, anything touching poverty in Canada, which is a very multifaceted experience and issue. And so we're interested in understanding who is experiencing poverty in Canada, why are they experiencing it, and what can be done about it. And we do that particularly with an emphasis on people's lived experiences to make sure that our policies and our recommendations are really grounded in what people are living with in their day-to-day lives, and also with an equity lens to make sure that the outcomes of our policy decisions, the outcomes of our responses to poverty have equal outputs or equitable outputs for people regardless of any number of factors. So we do engage with MPs and senators and other elected officials. We work with other advocacy groups. We often have workshops in church basements or community halls, schools, you name it. So again, trying to create opportunities for people to come together to learn and to take action together to make sure that we have good public policies in this country.
Now, we're delighted that you're involved with a conference on polarization. And polarization is a term that has different definitions. Obviously, it can be a situation where we have people at various extremes of the political spectrum. It also, I think, in this day and age, is defined a little bit differently. It's not about people differing over an issue, having different perspectives or different opinions. It's the fact that those that do hold different, I mean, that's the starting point, but those that do hold differing opinions and perspectives really have absolutely no use for people on the other side. They see them as offering nothing to the conversation. They don't really want to hear their views. And as we talked about in other podcasts, it often comes down to understanding the world in this way. I have my views, which are the correct views. There's people out there who unfortunately don't hold my views. And that's because of one of two reasons. One is they're bad people, or the second is because they're not enlightened. And once I explain to them the error of their ways, they will, of course, come around to my way of thinking. And I think in some ways that's, it's sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek way to define it, but goodness, as you read so much commentary, that often seems to be the way. So that's kind of the state of the play of polarization. And maybe people listening to this podcast are saying, well, what does poverty have to do with polarization?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few connections. So one is that the ways in which we respond to poverty or the policies that we call for or reject in response to poverty can elicit some very polarized responses. And some of that has to do with sort of this inability for us to speak across our different experiences, or, a prejudgment that is maybe made that makes it difficult for us to listen to another person's point of view on a topic. I would say that also it comes into play in that a lot of conversations about poverty, its causes, its potential solutions can be very politicized as well as polarized. So then you also get sort of this polarization of camps based on what particular political affiliation is associated with any particular policy or response or even understanding of the causes of poverty. So it can be both at an interpersonal level in terms of sort of an us versus them idea, in terms of, how we think about people who experience poverty, or, if we are someone who experiences poverty ourselves, we might have different views of people who aren't living in poverty or other people who are living in poverty. And then likewise, again, depending on which type of response to poverty you favor, that we can kind of form our camps, and we don't always do a great job of speaking to one another. But that's one of the reasons why CPJ is specifically a nonpartisan organization. And it's also one of the reasons that we do try to engage with people's lived experiences in our research and engage in good dialogue, because certainly, if you're just surrounded with an echo chamber, you're not going to develop very good policy, because it might work for some people and it might reflect some people's realities, but you're going to miss out on the perspectives and experiences of many others.
How do you deal with in your work the question of equity, the question that there's a lot of people out there who are working very, very hard, who are just getting by, and they resent, let's use the word, they resent the fact that their precious the precious amount of their income is going to tax dollars to support people who they don't see as pulling their weight, or, in a time of low unemployment, are not working. Obviously, there's been lots of talk of late around some sort of a basic income, and you certainly hear pushback. You've sort of the economists talk about it, but you also have just sort of ordinary citizens saying, I'm not going to pay for someone to not work. I work too hard for that money. So I don't know how much I see that as sort of a polarizing part of this discussion. And how do you address it?
Yeah, so I think it can be very polarizing when people feel that something that they've worked hard at is maybe not appreciated or is in jeopardy of being taken away from them. And so, just generally having concerns about being able to provide for themselves or their loved ones in the future, what will happen to the economy or, employment prospects for their loved ones or children moving along. So I think the first step to mitigate some of this polarization is to really listen to where people's concerns are coming from and what is at the root of those fears or concerns. And this is one of the reasons why the workshop that I'll be sharing at the conference has to do with moving from a scarcity mindset to one of solidarity. And so the workshop looks at scarcity and surveillance and shifting from there to solidarity. And so often when we talk about poverty and responses to poverty, we kind of get this idea that if we invest in basic income, or if we invest in pharmacare, or we invest in affordable housing, that we have so few limited resources that must mean that something is going to be taken away from someone else. The reality is that if we zoom out a little bit and we look at our policy decisions more broadly, if we think about, well, what really is government here to do in the first place? And, how do we make decisions about what are our priorities as a society, and how might we invest accordingly? How might we act accordingly? Well, it kind of helps us to get out of this idea that, we've only got X number of dollars that we can spend on housing, or we've only got X number of dollars we can spend on social assistance, or else everything else is going to fail and we won't have money for other things that we need, or it's going to be too expensive. So again, I think this kind of calls into question some other themes of just, a polarization in terms of how much we trust or don't trust public institutions, maybe some concerns about how public funds are being used. Are they being used efficiently? Are they being used effectively? And who is bearing the brunt of these policy decisions? So there are a lot of bigger questions that I think help us to kind of get us beyond our sense of me versus them, or us versus them, to think again about, well, what is the purpose of these public policies in general? What's the purpose of government in our society? And if we can agree that, the purpose, the shared value that we can hold together is that we want people to be able to enjoy an adequate standard of living, regardless of race or gender or country of origin, or any number of factors, then we start to ask different questions about how we might design our policies and how we might respond to people who are experiencing poverty that has more of a whole of society focus and shifts us out of a me versus them mentality.
What about outcomes? I always say that whenever I'm really struggling in a lecture, you'll know it because I'll ask students whether they would give change or money to a homeless person who they suspect or knew was going to spend it on drugs or alcohol, that sort of thing. And the reason why I always that's my go-to is because you always sit back and there's about 40 minutes of debate. And what I find very interesting is students have all these conditions. They will give money if basically that individual, it's funny, turns into them. If that individual uses that money to get a job, to basically become a kind of middle class, tax-paying, respectable citizen who works at IBM or something, if they're going to take that money to do a resume writing course, that's fine. But if they're going to take that money to buy a can of beer, well, forget it. I would never do that. And I do wonder in this discussion about the outcome question, because it's okay, you've convinced me you can take a little bit of my taxpayers' money, but boy, those people better find a job, get better education, get their lives together the way I define it, or else. And so how does that factor into the discussion?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few angles there, but I think what you're getting at is this idea of surveillance, which we'll explore in the workshop as well. That we expect there to be a lot of scrutiny towards people with low income who are receiving cash transfers from the government or who are participating in programs that are publicly funded. And, I would just say, well, do we require the same level of scrutiny of people at other income levels? I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that people with great wealth are making, much better decisions with how to spend their money, but they're cushioned by that wealth from a lot of the adverse impacts that people with low income might be. But at the same time, what we see in, again, looking at research and people's lived experiences of what happens when we invest in adequate social assistance rates or even something like a basic income, we just don't find that those fears are really grounded in people's actual experiences of those programs. So what we actually see is that if you take away the stress of wondering how you're going to pay for your next meal, or whether you should pay for your kids' medication or your own, or whether you're going to be able to afford your rent or have to, couch surf or stay in a shelter. If you take away that chronic stress of poverty, that you're able to make better decisions. The findings show that when people have a stable housing situation, when there is income support, what we saw, whether you're looking at basic income pilots or even looking at how people used things like the emergency pandemic benefits, we saw that people spent them on housing, they spent it on food. For basic income, sometimes people spent it on things like an appliance that needed to be replaced that they could never save enough from that meager social assistance, which, nowhere in the country except in some cases for certain populations in Quebec even approaches the poverty line. People use the money to go back to school so that they could get a better job. And so we didn't actually see any work disincentives. We didn't see an impact on labor force participation. So the evidence just doesn't bear out these suspicions that we have. And I've heard from people who went into social work because they really cared about people and wanted to support people. And then they found out that their job was actually going to involve going into people's apartments to snoop around and find out if there was any evidence that someone else might be living there so that they could share the rent, because, well, then that would mean that their social assistance rate would be reduced, for example, even though they're not provided with enough money to live on their own. So there's a great deal of surveillance and scrutiny. It's even happening in discussions right now about how to design the forthcoming Canada Disability Benefit. One of the biggest questions that was brought to a certain roundtable was like, well, what are we going to do about fraud, and how are we going to punish people if they're applying for this benefit and don't actually aren't actually eligible, and again, when we look at the research on the amount of, let's say, financial abuse that happens with social assistance programs or things like a disability benefit, it's really a negligible amount. It's hardly worth the investment of staffing and bureaucracy that would go into tracking it down, just like tracking down people with low income who received pandemic benefits, spent it on what it was intended for, but then found out later that maybe they weren't eligible. And so there's a tremendous amount of effort going into trying to get money back from people who are living in poverty. And it just doesn't make sense, because in fact, we end up spending more money down the road when people are living in poverty, when they're unhoused, when they can't eat properly. We end up spending much more in health costs, in the criminal justice system. So when people are concerned that their tax dollars are going to support people in poverty, well, it's actually more expensive to not deal with poverty or to prevent it in the first place than it is to deal with the downstream effects.
What do you think are the biggest sort of negative or false stereotypes about the poor that are out there? What are sort of the myths about people living in poverty that need to be busted? Myth busting.
Yeah, well, I'm hesitant to name too many stereotypes because I don't want to repeat any. For anyone who's listening to this who has experienced, who's been on the sharp end of these accusations or suspicions, I don't want to re-traumatize anyone. But I guess just in general, like there's just this sense again that people in poverty are worse. On any factor, less trustworthy, less capable, not working as hard. And again, people in poverty are human beings like anyone else. And there's no justification for the level of scrutiny and surveillance that's imposed on people in poverty when you compare it to people with great amounts of wealth. So again, this mistrust of wondering, what people will do if they're provided with adequate income assistance or housing. That I think again, a lot of this is maybe one of the outcomes of our polarization is that we just haven't heard their stories. If folks are not within our own circle of experience, it's so easy for us to only connect and communicate with people who are living a similar lifestyle to ourselves. And as a society, some of our responses to poverty are just to hide it and to push it out of sight. And so that only exacerbates this effect of polarization where we don't encounter people who have different experiences. And so it leaves us free to kind of assume the worst sometimes. Whereas,
And I mean, a certain number of, there's a large percentage of people living in poverty who are working, right? There's a large percentage of people living in poverty who are children.
Yeah. The majority of people with low incomes actually have wages as their main source of income. And children are the most likely demographic to be living in poverty among all residents in this country. So, there's all kinds of people that are experiencing poverty not because of poor decisions that they've made at any one time or another, but because of, again, I don't want to remove anyone's sense of agency either, but there are systems and policies in place that are causing and perpetuating poverty, and that make it really difficult for people to exit poverty once they fall into that situation. So we have a lot of cyclical experiences, and given the number of children that are living in poverty in Canada, it increases their likelihood that they will be experiencing poverty as adults, and so that cycle continues. And sometimes you can look even at just the huge impacts of the generational transfer of wealth. So right now in Canada, I think the best predictor of social mobility is the wealth of previous generations, and which doesn't sound very shocking or surprising, but when you consider the historic and even contemporary policies that exist in Canada, and you think about who was able to own property and who's able to afford property now, there's much more at play in our systems than someone, I don't know, blowing their OSAP money on throughout college or university and then getting stuck. So we just don't have the same strength of social safety net that we once did. And that's for a number of reasons. It's our social assistance rates have not kept pace with the cost of living. Our wages haven't kept pace with the cost of living. The relationship between employees and employers has changed drastically. We have many people that are precariously employed or in gig economies. And so we just don't have the same situation that we did, 30, 40, 50 years ago in this country in terms of our social safety net. And so sometimes even people who have experienced poverty themselves have a hard time understanding the experiences of people who are living in poverty today, because there's this sense that they were able to make do, they were able to work hard and get out of poverty. And so why can't someone else? And again, a lot of it comes down to hearing those people's stories, hearing them explain what their experiences have been and what is keeping them in this state, and what do they need to meaningfully move forward and be able to enjoy an adequate standard of living.
And I want to go back to what you were talking about, sort of the hidden nature of poverty. I mean, it's fascinating when you think about it. We often, speak about, for example, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. How many of us have met someone who's Indigenous or interacted? How many? We're talking about a number of different identities. It's this, why don't we sit down and actually meet with someone who has it? And I guess I'm wondering. I don't know. This is a very tough question, but how do we create a society where there might be more of an opportunity to hear that stories and maybe go beyond? Listen, there's absolutely nothing wrong with people who volunteer and that sort of thing, but move a little bit from the relationship of I'm going to be at the soup kitchen and I'll ladle soup and hear your story, to actually interacting with them. And I don't know if that's something that you've thought about or CPJ's thought about. It's just it is this amazing divide that. Are we really going to just sit and listen to someone who's poor and not be in a situation where our only relationship is I've got the money in my pocket and I'm giving an extreme case, but someone's asking you for money on the street. That's not exactly an equal relationship.
Yeah, well, I'd say the first thing I would say, John, is that people have been so generous with sharing their stories and really sharing like a real glimpse into their lives and their souls even for generations. And I would just say, like, there's such a wealth of resources out there if people are curious about, the experiences of people who have experienced the kind of intergenerational trauma that is common among First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in this country as a result of colonization and ongoing colonial policies, that those stories are out there and readily accessible. If you want to hear about people's experiences who live in poverty, again, there's scads of research reports, and part of the problem is that people have been asked to share so often, so much, and then so little has been done in response to that gift of sharing, that gift of trust that's been given. So the first thing that I would say is start with what has already been given. Not everyone is going to be in a position where they feel that they're able to or want to share their life story with you just because you happen to be that person holding the ladle of the soup kitchen. And we're not entitled to people's stories. Those are gifts that people have shared, and so many have done so already that I think we owe it to people to make use of those resources that are there. But, if you're at a soup kitchen, for example, a lot of soup kitchens or food banks or, shelters are increasingly, I would say, engaging people from the communities that are being served in providing the services themselves. So sometimes that's called, peer leaders or peer employees. And, we all want to feel that our gifts, our contributions are being recognized and valued. And so, rather than, as you said, get stuck in sort of this position of I'm the helper and you're the person who's being helped. There are a lot of opportunities where we can come together where we see one another as partners who are working together to try to address a problem. And, through those types of relationships, then there are more opportunities for sharing of stories, if people are interested. So I think, to move beyond this idea that, some of us are the helpers and others are the ones being helped, or I think it's important for us to recognize that common humanity that we share, and that whether we are someone who is currently living in poverty or someone who has more wealth, that our well-being, our rights even, are still bound up together. And I think this is where we shift from that idea of surveillance or scarcity to solidarity, where we can see that, in a society that allows certain groups of people, certain people to be considered, worthless or cast aside, expendable, that's harmful for all of us. Certainly, I don't mean to equalize our experiences or our harms, but there's also research that shows that in societies with greater inequality, that even the folks that are at that higher end of the income spectrum are more likely to suffer mental health problems. As a society, we're more likely to experience a lot of distrust. A lot of this polarization is exacerbated by increasing inequality among people within a society. So I think we really need to ask ourselves, do these inequitable outcomes that we're seeing in our society, what do they tell us about our priorities, about our shared values as a society? And, do they reflect those shared values? If we say that we want Canada to be a place where everyone can thrive, well, is that reflected in the way that we respond to poverty and the way we respond to one another? Do our responses reflect this value that many of us hold? Whether in the Christian tradition, it's expressed as the Imago Dei, this idea that each person is created in the image of God with inherent dignity and worth. And I'd say similar teachings are found in many other faiths and cultures. So, does our society reflect that value? Do our interactions with other people demonstrate that value? Or do they suggest that actually, one would draw the conclusion from our society that, well, actually these people are considered more worthy than these other folks? So I think, again, we want to see our common humanity. We want to recognize that we actually are all better off by every metric that I can think of if we invest and create programs and policies in our country where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, and everyone and the planet too, the environment, the physical environment as well. This interconnectedness of our well-being is really critical to move from that scarcity and surveillance to a solidarity mindset.
Because I think, it fits this whole discussion fits polarization in a sort of coming at it from a different angle, in that those who are living in poverty, there is this which we've talked about today, this great divide between them and sort of mainstream society. And I think that those people who, have a good income They see them as the other, but they also, to go back to our original definition of polarization, they don't see them as having anything to offer, anything to bring to this discussion and move forward. So, it's I think something that is worth exploring in the context of polarization, the polarizing nature of the subject, but also the deep divisions that exist in our society. And as you point out, every study shows that we're looking at greater divisions. I mean, those at the top are a lot farther removed from those at the bottom of the economic ladder, and there's something quite disturbing about it. So we only have a few minutes left. Tell us about the actual workshop, from scarcity and surveillance to solidarity. Just a few, I guess, high-level overview of what's going to happen at the outcome, and as a way of luring in all the registrants. So
great. Well, I hope it'll be a great opportunity for us to explore together what our current responses to poverty in Canada reveal about some of the underlying assumptions and beliefs are that exist, and then looking at ways that we can explore alternative policies, alternative attitudes, ways of doing things that help to cultivate that sense of solidarity and that are grounded in a more rights-based approach. And so I'll share a little bit about current experiences of poverty in Canada, some current policy responses, what some of the outcomes of those current responses are, and then some possible alternatives. And we'll do that in a way that invites questions and, that avoids the polarization of this issue by removing it from, political affiliations and discussing these issues in a nonpartisan way. So hopefully it'll be a chance to explore together and share some good conversation, and look forward to meeting the folks who show up.
Great. Well, it sounds like a fascinating session that's going to be part of a fascinating conference that we've spent several podcasts discussing. And again, for more information on the conference and to register, please visit our website, Luther's website, at luther.wlu.ca under the Spotlight section. And Natalie's workshop is one of several that are going to be exploring different aspects of this issue of polarization. So, Natalie, lots more to discuss, such a complex issue, but I think it's very, very exciting that we're looking at it through this little bit of a different lens in terms of polarization, because having that discussion is part of the solution as we move forward, and we can't do it in this sort of polarized world. So I'm really looking forward to your session at the conference, and I want to thank you for taking time to speak to us today.
Thanks, John. It's been my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to attending some of the other sessions as well.
And we look forward to seeing all of our listeners for April 18th to the 20th at Luther, Beyond Culture Wars, Fostering Solidarity in an Age of Polarization. As I say, check out our website, luther.wlu.ca, and we hope to see you there. We hope you enjoyed this edition of The Moment, a production of the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College, the founding institution of Wilfrid Laurier University, located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Visit our website, luther.wlu.ca, for resources and more information on other podcasts. The technical producer of today's recording was Christopher Macheline, with support from Alex Kinsella. Creative Commons music was provided by Jason Shaw on audionautics.com. Thanks for joining us.